The Russian armed forces keep advancing at Avdiivka, clearly aiming to achieve a breakthrough against whittled down Ukrainians that have trouble consolidating their defense. Also, Ukraine claims they keep shooting down planes, but something is a little fishy. So we'll talk about this as well as about other events behind the front line and the other two topics, the leaked peace plan. We have more details about what Russia asked for from Ukraine to make a peace in April 2022, as well as the Taurus leak, where German officers talked with each other about the potential use of the Taurus in Ukraine. We'll talk about this and more in the situation report. Overall, we're starting off with the Ukrainian claims of shooting down planes. Basically, for the last 2 weeks, more or less, they keep claiming on average one plane downed per day. Most of the time, it's Sukhoi 34. Those are the fighter bombers that are mostly used to drop the glide bombs, but there's barely any proof. Some proof that appears later turns out to be a fake. For instance, one shot down plane supposedly shows, in fact, a hay pile that was set ablaze that was then sold to be a shot down plane. So it's unclear. Even if those shoot downs are true, Russia roughly has 300 planes capable of dropping glide bombs, at least 300 that are ready for operations. So the Russians could sustain the losses for a couple of weeks if necessary, because at the same time the glide bomb attacks against Ukrainian targets continue every single day and play a big role in the Russian successes that they achieve along Avdiivka. And we also have glide bomb attacks at other parts of the front line, so the Russians seem completely undeterred of the usage of glide bombs, despite supposedly losing one plane per day. And that's the somewhat fishy part, because usually in the past we've seen when the Russians had surprising losses, they changed their behavior. We had that at Krinky, where the Ukrainians shot down several Russian planes, and basically immediately once that happened, the glide bomb usage against Krinky stopped, at least for the time being. We even have that freshly now. According to the Ukrainians, the Russians haven't flown for 6 days an A-50, basically their AVAX, over the Azov Sea after the second one was shot down there, proving my point that they usually adjust their behavior once they've shot down. So while Ukraine claims one plane shot down per day, that only leaves more or less two options. First is Ukraine is lying. Now that might not be lying in the meaning of intentionally not telling the truth. It could be part of it. It can be fog of war too, that they see a plane on their radar screen, they see their own air defense missile closing in on it, and then both the missile as well as the plane disappear simply because the missile has detonated with its proximity fuse into the chaff of the plane, and the plane dove down and is disappearing close to the ground. Something like this can be a reason. The other thing is proving it will obviously be difficult if the planes are tens of kilometers behind the front line. Unless they have somebody on that side taking a picture, there's hardly any proof. But while this is a possibility, as it's weird that the Russians keep flying their strike missions despite suffering painful losses, the other option is not better by any means, and that's that those losses are actually true, but Russia is willing to sustain those losses and is willing to accept those losses because they see the cost of sustaining the glide bomb strikes are worth it, what they currently achieve, which shows that Russia believes they can achieve a proper breakthrough and go back into a war of movement fairly soon. And then obviously sacrificing another 20 or 30 planes might be absolutely worth it if they manage to get into a war of movement afterwards. So whatever it is, something is problematic here. Even though it sounds like a victory that Ukraine shoots down tons of planes, it's not that clear that it actually is, because the implications of it are not positive for Ukraine, even if they manage to shoot them down. Still, let's go to the events along the front line. We have a geolocalized Russian advance here at Tabivka. The Russians reached to this position here, close to the town of Tabaivka. The Ukrainians then counterattacked and managed to regain the foothold and re-establish themselves here on the high ground above the town. So the situation hasn't fundamentally changed there, but we've seen some Russian advance. There's actually it seems to be a Ukrainian advance further south here, and this is here. We see the knob here. This is close to Yampulivka and Terny, as we've talked about a couple of times in the past, and we can see it here right at that blob. The Ukrainians have been spotted, and this is here. So there is geolocalized proof of Russian strikes against Ukrainian units, and it's hitting here. So it seems the Ukrainians are holding a position further to the southeast. It's unclear, obviously, if this is freshly recaptured by the Ukrainians or if they have been there all along. But I think, at least at these positions up here, we've recently seen Russians. I think this should be a recaptured territory by the Ukrainians, at least here close to Terny. This is obviously important because if the Russians manage to cut off the supply lines here and cut off the supply lines further north, then the whole front line will be in trouble, as the ground lines of communications are limited due to the Oskil and the Sherebets, those two rivers here that run more or less parallel to the front line. If you reach it at some point and at one point and manage to cut off the roads passing by, then the whole front line will be stabilized. So for the Ukrainians, it's important to keep the Russians away from Terny. Further south, we have developments, also bad developments for the Ukrainians. The Russians have now not just entered Ivanivske. We've recently talked that they have been here. They captured more or less at the very least half of the town. This much is geolocalized. This is cutting off increasingly the supply lines towards the south, towards Klishivka and Andriivka. They have still some opportunities to cross the canal here, but it is increasingly causing them trouble, and it will probably lead, if the Russians keep advancing inside of Ivanivske, there's little doubt that the Ukrainians will have to give up Klishivka and Andriivka and withdraw to the other side of the Donetsk Canal. I think that's the Donetsk Canal, this canal that you can see here, as they will be cut off otherwise from their supply routes. Further south at Avdiivka, the Russians keep advancing. This is the theme of the last few days. They've not only lost the first line here, Stepove, Lasturkine, Siverne. Now the Russians are in Tonenke. They have reached the waters here at Orlivka. They have entered the northern part. They also are proven to have entered Berdichy. They keep pushing. They have not crossed the waterways here. It's likely that the Ukrainians have positions on this high ground here. But we've talked in a past situation report that it seems that there is another line of fortifications here. What we see right now is the Russians keeping up the pressure, advancing to push the Ukrainians back, as every day the Ukrainians have stopped the Russians to hold the front line. This will allow rear areas to be increasingly fortified. And this is one of the problems that has revealed itself, that Ukraine, for whatever reason, has massively neglected building fortifications in its rear areas, because there was either by military or civilian authority a massive oversight, or maybe by both of them. So the fortifications, even though they had 2 years of time, and we are only talking about a few kilometers away from the previous front line, there's still no solid line of defense in a strength that is likely to hold the Russians back for a long time. At least it's doubtful at this very moment. The Ukrainians are reported to have done a number of counterattacks along this line here towards Orlivka, Berdichy, and east of Semenivka. Also, some attacks towards Tonenke are reported, but at least all the claims, I do not even see Ukrainian claims that those counterattacks have been successful, so they seem to have been pointless. The Russians are obviously framing it that Syrski is trying to save it by throwing more bodies against the Russians, and that those attacks suffer heavy losses. Unfortunately, the fact about the heavy losses seems likely, as those counterattacks are done without any serious artillery support, and drones can only do so much. So the situation at Avdiivka remains critical, and the more the Russians advance, the more critical it actually gets, as if the likely fallback line for the Ukrainians, where they meant to stop the Russians permanently, the second line of defense, is doesn't seem to be up for the task. At least it was recently just reported by the Ukrainians themselves that those lines have just been started to be built, so they shouldn't be able to hold the Russians back for long, especially if they keep pounding them with glide bombs. Further south, we have changes in Marinka as well, close to Marinka. The Russians have settled down here over that waterway towards the south of Pobieda. We have a geolocalization freshly here that they are now in these buildings as well. So we know the Russians had a slow advance here. In Novomikhailivka, they also advanced. We already see it here on the map. There is a geolocalization that they've entered basically the center of the town in the south. They haven't crossed through it, but they gained additional ground inside of the town, which is for now holding them back at this part of the front line, as it's still mostly held by the Ukrainians. About Vuleda, I have no change in territory, nothing to report. Same about Novomikhailivka. At south of Orikhiv, there are some claims by the Russians that they gained additional ground. Now, we had that video of the Russians unloading BMPs, two BMPs there, so unloading soldiers there. But another video later appeared that showed that those soldiers were unloaded in the majority, or all of them became casualties. So it seems unlikely that the Russians hold that part. We knew I already said it in the last situation report, that the Ukrainians must have been here or back here. So as of now, at least, I cannot confirm that anything has changed about the Robotine, but the Russians claim that they gained 500 meters inside of the town and in the forested areas. It's simply that I cannot confirm it because I don't see visual evidence and I don't have Ukrainian reliable sources admitting that they were defeated there. We also, further west, we have no changes, and at Krinky there are additional claims that the Ukrainians gained some additional territory inside of Krinky. I do not see any visual evidence of this, so I leave the situation from my understanding more or less unchanged. Let's go to the overall situation. Now we go back to Bakhmut at first. Should Ivanivske fall, this is going to be a serious trouble. We have here is Ivanivske on the map, on a topographic map. You can see Ivanivske here, and it's close to a high ground. If the Russians manage to get through it, and they are already up here in this area, if they manage to gain the high ground, they will be able to dominate Andrivka and Klishivka here. As you can see, this is a serious difference in altitude, 225 to 150 meters. So this is 75 meters in less than a kilometer in distance. So dominating the heights here will make it impossible to defend Klishivka. So it seems likely as of now that as Ivanivske seems to be poised to fall, that Klishivka and Andrivka will probably also be lost. The interesting part here is that a Ukrainian military spokesperson said the defense of Chasiv Yar is well prepared. So they have several rings of defenses around Chasiv Yar. All of this is nice, I guess, for them. But the interesting part is that he says that since the fall of Bakhmut, they built defenses. And then again, the question is, why did they wait until Bakhmut fell? Were they so self-confident that they said, we are never going to lose Bakhmut until it was actually taken by the Russians, so they saw no need to it? What if the Russians had managed to push further after that capture? Why weren't defenses prepared in the rear areas? And I know a lot of my viewers like to mock the Russians, and they have shown a lot of weaknesses, a lot of incompetence in the past, but we've also seen that they started building defensive works, for instance, here on the Isthmus of Perekop, on the beaches here on the Crimean. We see them build defenses hundreds of kilometers behind the front line, or at least 150 kilometers, 100 miles behind the front line. This shows that, it's still good news, I guess, for Ukraine, because it shows that the Russians think the chance is higher than 0% of the Ukrainians attacking there. But at the same time, it shows that the Russians take it serious and they prepare defense in depth, which we so far have not seen in that degree by the Ukrainians. And we hear it from every part along the front line. Here, Chasiv Yar, now it might be well enough defended, but the fall of Bakhmut is almost a year ago, and they only started then to build up fortifications, at least if I'm not completely misinterpreting the words from the Ukrainian military spokesperson. But then again, we've had the same confirmations from Avdiivka that they just recently started building up a second line of defense. At Avdiivka, the Ukrainians are reporting that the Russians have switched from attacking with small groups to attacking in the size of companies and companies and a half, at times even attacks with full battalion tactical groups. This shows us that the Russians attack with ever bigger numbers, while the Ukrainians obviously have the choice to either concentrate their troops to be able to defend against the full battalion tactical groups. They need enough firepower to stop them, but this means they are forced to concentrate their own troops, which then can get obliterated with Russian artillery that is vastly superior because of the shell hunger from the Ukrainian side, or with glide bombs that can be struck here. There's, for instance, a picture from the defense of Orlivka, where we can see huge craters where prior to that positions of the Ukrainians have likely have been. As we can see, it's geolocalized to the outskirts of Orlivka, and now we have massive craters in where previously houses have been. If you want to stop a full battalion tactical group, you need at least half a company, if not more, and they have to be close enough together to be able to concentrate fire. But that means you present yourself, your troops, to the firepower of the Russians, and obviously the Russians can concentrate those troops now because of the rules that applied for the last year and a half, that concentrating troops is suicide because of the artillery threat, while there's omnipresent surveillance through small drones. This is no longer applying, at least for the moments. Now the Ukrainians do still have drones to surveil. They can still see a Russian troop concentration. They can still try to attack it with FPV drones, while the Russians increasingly increase their electronic warfare abilities to fight them back, to stop the FPV drones. But what would stop a Russian troop concentration, that is concentrated artillery firepower, is simply no longer up for the question, as we talked in the past, because the West has decided to not put up the effort to supply Ukraine adequately. And right now the Ukrainians are paying dearly for that, as they are able to concentrate troops and thus simply overwhelm the Ukrainians, for the reason that they can't concentrate troops at the same time. Otherwise, they'll be eliminated. So the big question here will be, where will the Russians be stopped? There are already fears inside of Ukraine that in summer 2024 the Russians might gain significant territory. Now there are some fantasies that the Russians will reach the Dnipro. This seems unlikely as of now, but they have to be stopped somewhere, and with the firepower discrepancy, they have to be stopped in solidly fortified positions that can sustain enemy assaults for a extended period of time, and that will only work with a massive build-up of those fortifications, reinforced concrete, all of this, and that can't be done directly behind the front line, and that can't be done at a point where the Russians are appearing in the next few hours. So where a solid front line will be built up, no clue. Now, it can be that the Ukrainians are now suddenly able to stop them. So far, they haven't crossed the waterway. Supposedly, there's one line going here. So maybe they'll stop them here, but what if not? Well, we'll have to see. But as of now, we can clearly see the effects of the Ukrainian shell hunger. We can see it on the developments along the front line. Russia is also trying to build up its forces. Rostec has declared they're going to restart production of the A-50. That's those AVAX type planes that were shot down, 2 of them, by the Ukrainians recently. And there is a Russian mill blogger claiming here fighter bomber, which is usually well informed about the air topic in Russia. He's claiming that they just received a new A-50U. I'm not sure what that is supposed to mean, because I was not aware of one being in construction or in being refurbished. On the other hand, it's known that the Russians had A-50 that were decommissioned but were still standing around somewhere. So maybe they managed to refurbish one, but that wouldn't be a new one, at least if we take him seriously. So no clue. It might be pure lies, but for a Russian mill blogger, this channel has been not completely irrelevant, and has to be taken somewhat serious. So I have no idea. I don't think it seems unlikely that this is actually a new A-50, but at least it's a possibility. At the same time, Putin has signed a decree that reservists are being called up for combat exercises. Now, this can be interpreted in 2 ways. First of all, once they're called up, and they're being called up for combat exercises, not for a mobilization. So supposedly they're only going to train and then return home. This should mean that the majority will follow the calls and not try to disappear in the woods or cross the borders, even if they don't want to fight. But with the partial mobilization still in effect, they could probably still just once they are in uniform, once they are equipped, they could probably be handed their mobilization papers. So this might be a precursor to a second wave of mobilization that could come at a later point. It's obviously unclear what that means. At the other time, there's also the interpretation that once they are basically in the grip of the government, the crypto mobilization will continue, that they are being shown that that they are being given incentives to sign, or that they'll be pressured to sign contracts to keep up the recruitment for the Russian armed forces. Anyways, we'll have to see there as well if there's another wave of mobilization this summer. It seems unlikely regarding the current recruitment efforts by the Russians, but we'll have to see. Russia has sentenced an Estonian citizen to 10 years in prison in absentia for fighting alongside Ukraine and for damaging a war memorial. Now, the interesting part is that they specifically mention the part of fighting alongside the Ukrainian against Russia, and this is clearly a war crime. Not fighting with Ukraine, but sentencing him for it. The Geneva Convention leaves no doubt that a legal combatant cannot be punished for the simple act of fighting, which Russia plans to do in this case. And they actually even sentenced him in absentia for 10 years in prison. And we've talked about it in the past on this channel. The conditions for a foreigner fighting in Ukraine to be considered a mercenary are clearly stated by the Geneva Conventions, and they are accumulative. So they are end conditions. Every single one of these conditions has to be fulfilled for the fighter to be considered a mercenary. And the foreign legions, the volunteers fighting inside of Ukraine, don't fit the conditions, as for instance, they are not being paid more than the regular soldiers. They are being paid a fairly solid price, especially for Ukraine, but they are not getting paid an additional foreigner bonus or anything like this. And that already leaves them out. That already means they are no longer mercenaries. They are also not fulfilling several other options as well. But I said I've talked about it in the past. So this would be sentencing someone who is a legal combatant for the, in quotation mark, crimes of fighting as a legal combatant, which would clearly be a war crime. And the other thing is, obviously, he's a citizen of a NATO and European Union country where Russia says they're going to sentence somebody in who's a citizen of a foreign country for doing something outside of Russia. Also, the Cheka OGPU channel once again has given us some interesting insight. Now, this is a well-connected intelligence channel that inside of intelligence, inside of Russian intelligence, well-connected channel, and they are talking here about the information warfare attempts that Russia does in Latin America, especially in Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, but among them in other states as well. Obviously, everyone who knows the region knows that there are always sentiments against the United States, against the gringos, and what the Russians try to build upon here is that they want to sell that supporting Russia in this war means that you support somebody who is against US hegemony, and thus appealing to the Latin American countries where it works at the same time, showing once more how Russia plans to succeed in the information warfare as well. Also, the plan for Russia's peace was published now. That supposedly was ready in April of 2022 when Ukraine defeated the Russians at Kiev, where they found the Bucha massacre and where the West showed that they are willing to help Ukraine defend itself, and the details are spicy. Ukraine is not allowed, according to the treaty, or would have been, we would have to say, would have been not allowed to receive foreign weapons or foreign soldiers. So if they can't produce it themselves, then they won't have those weapons. And of course, Ukraine can't produce everything. The military would be limited to 85,000 men, 342 tanks, and 519 artillery. Ukraine said, at the very least, we want 250,000 soldiers, 800 MBTs, and 1,900 artillery pieces. Ukraine was supposed to not own missiles with a range longer than 40 kilometers, thus taking away any ability for Ukraine to strike rear targets. For instance, in the first days of the war, they struck an airport that was used by the Russian military aviation with a Tochka-U missile, but that would have been no longer possible in this context. And the spicy part is also neutrality would be part of the treaty, so they would not be allowed to join NATO, but they would be the treaty would be guaranteed by a number of states. Those were supposed to be United States, United Kingdom, China, France, and Russia. Russia also wanted to add Belarus, and Ukraine wanted to add Turkey. The spicy part was, though, every security guarantor was supposed to cancel all treatments with Ukraine that would infringe with that neutrality. So any training agreement, any aid agreement, any alliance agreement would be canceled. And now this shows the absurdity. If Ukraine needs international assistance because they are now helpless, they have a tiny army and somebody is invading them, they would have to appeal to those guarantors and they would have to be unanimous. Now, who is the most likely nation to invade Ukraine? Probably Russia. And Russia would have to agree to a military intervention against itself for that security guarantee to be anything worth anything. So those security guarantees were non-existent, while Ukraine would be barred from buying foreign weapons and while its military would be a better police force regarding its size. Obviously, this would mean that Ukraine is no longer a sovereign state. They would be forced to do whatever Russia wants with a permanent threat of invasion that could neither be defeated nor could be prevented internationally, as this would be the treaty of it. Also, Crimea would have been given up, and the Donetsk and Luhansk would have been the result of negotiations between Zelensky and Putin, with an expected outcome, especially regarding the discrepancies in power after the signing of such a treaty. It should have been more or less a foregone conclusion as well. So this was the peace offer that Russia offered, and when Ukraine saw that they can defeat the Russians at Kiev, at the Battle of Kiev, when they saw what the Russians did in occupied territory, both in Bucha as well as, for instance, in Sumy and in other places, and while the West offered them weapons, we shouldn't be too much surprised that Ukraine chose not to accept that quasi-capitulation that would turn them into a quasi-vassal state that has no sovereign choice about its decision. We see why that was the choice the Ukrainians took. Also, I skipped in my script a little. Let's before we finish, we have some international support as well. The European Union says they're gonna produce 2 million shells in 2025. Now, unfortunately, we've heard it in the past, some claims that 1 million shells will be given to Ukraine, and I think it turned out to be 300,000. So we'll have to see how much of those 2 million will actually be produced in 2025. The German company Rheinmetall said, though, that they are going to be able to produce 700,000 shells in 2024. So a good part of that is already on its way. Belgium is giving 200 million euros for the Czech grenades that Czech sourced abroad. The Netherlands pitched in with another 250 million, and the first shells can arrive within weeks. That's at least the reports. Ukraine also signed a 10-year security agreement with the Netherlands, but it's probably mostly in promises. As said, this is not going to be that the Dutch army will come to Ukraine's aid. And there's also, while we already talked about the anti-Western sentiments in Latin America, that is not completely one way, because Javier Milei said he's going to have a summit of Latin American support for Ukraine later that year, making a sharp difference with other regional leaders and that are supposedly neutral and thus not helping Ukraine and allowing Russia to continue with its invasion. There's also rumors that Argentina will hand over. It was said Mi-17. I researched a little, and what I found is that Argentina had M171s, which is another version of the Mi-8 or Mi-17, but they aren't maintained anymore. So either they are not flight worthy or they aren't safe to fly anymore. And according to some reports, Argentina will give 2 of them to Ukraine. I can't fully confirm that, though. And We have international support. Obviously, I guess in the last 24 hours or so, the big topic was the Taurus leak. I listened to it, and as a native German speaker who was in the military, I can say that the talk was clearly authentic. I think by now it's admitted that it was authentic, and it was the only spectacular thing about this was that it was leaked. The talk itself was spectacularly unspectacular. It's a few high-ranking soldiers talking about an expected briefing with the defense minister, and while saying what they're going to talk to him, and they thought about how would Germany be able to allow Ukraine using the Taurus without German soldiers having to help the Ukrainians inside of Ukraine. So they were basically planning and saying we could do this way, and if they want to have it more accurate, they need certain kind of data, and to give that we could either send it with a data link with a cable, or we could simply drive it with a car over the border. So discussing topics like this, all of this was to be expected. Germany is de facto allied with Ukraine. It's helping it in a war against Russia, and Ukraine is asking for a weapon system that was, at least in the past, likely to be given to Ukraine, that those who are responsible for helping the political side making decisions think about how that can be used, how that can be fulfilled, is self-explanatory. So nothing special about this, that they think about what can be done. The only spectacular thing was that Russia was able to make a copy of that call, and that Russia decided to leak it, obviously showing the failure of the German counterintelligence, and at the same time the embarrassment. They clearly intended to create the political divisions inside of Europe, inside of Germany, and the two fifth column parties in the German parliament that are clearly siding with Russia are already calling for criminal investigations for aiding. And they actually said that for aiding an offensive war by doing that, because they plan to attack Russia with those things. So this is obviously ludicrous, but they have the intended political effect that was here. So the big part of this was more that Russian information warfare was willing to burn a source of information. As they were able to record this meeting, they were obviously able to record other meetings as well. And now the German government, the German military knows that their systems are compromised and they will change. This is in my mind, the most interesting part. And finally, before we finish, we have a historic example. That's an interesting video here. Now, this is the Russian side showing that they have damaged wheels. And this is actually the Ukrainians using caltrops. Caltrops, as we can see here, are basically 4 metal pieces that are welded together and thus thrown, and thus, because it's 4 pieces made in certain angles, it guarantees that one is always looking vertically up. The first use of caltrops that is historically recorded was in 331 before Christ in the Battle of Gaugamela, where Alexander the Great was fighting, showing a usage of a 2,300 at least 2,300-year-old weapon is still in use today, or as the saying goes, the more everything changes, the more everything stays the same. A really ancient method of warfare, tool of warfare, is still relevant today, and obviously extremely easy to use. Everything that is reliant on wheels will, with a system like this, be in big trouble, as this can be spread around, is cheaply produced in backyard factories, in scrap yards, and at the same time it can stop everything wheeled, especially once it's in high grass or anything hidden like this. So I thought this was an interesting video showing us how ancient methods of warfare can still be relevant today, while at the same time everyone talks about drones, and supposedly they have been placed with drones. So the modern aspect has played a role here as well, but it even seems to have damaged the rims itself. So it's not just the tires that are damaged, but the rims can take damage from those caltrops as well. That was it from me for now. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment. What do you think about the current developments? And for instance, what do you think about the Taurus event, the Taurus leak, or whether the Ukrainians will be able to stop the Russians at Avdiivka? And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to to everyone already supporting this channel. And that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.